All right, so let's talk a little bit about Anglo-American planning before we come back in here and finish the story of Stalingrad. The Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor, of course, turned this war into a global war and really did make it a world war. The British and the United States immediately began discussions on joint military planning within days after this Pearl Harbor strike. Winston Churchill was on a British battleship sailing to the United States before the week was out. He arrived in Washington. He spent a good deal of time at the White House with Franklin Roosevelt. He brought military advisors. The U.S. created, at this point, what today we call the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a body that had not yet existed, but we felt we needed to have a joint planning body that would work well with the British to jointly plan our war efforts. It was immediately decided by the U.S. and British governments that Germany was a far more dangerous opponent than Japan. The U.S. Navy wasn't happy about this decision. Admiral Ernest King, the commander of the U.S. Navy, felt that our war was the Pacific War, that we needed to get vengeance on Japan. Roosevelt looked at things quite differently. As far as he saw things, if Germany was defeated, Italy and Japan would follow. The Japanese and the Italians lack the industrial power to be really serious opponents. The Germans do not. And the Germans, if they were able to defeat the Soviet Union, would then pose a very significant threat to Great Britain. If Great Britain were to fall, the U.S. would have almost no means of striking back at Germany. So both Churchill and Roosevelt agreed fairly quickly on a strategy known as Germany First. And the U.S. and Britain would focus their efforts on Germany. For the United States, ideally, what this meant was that we would send troops to Britain and we would, as soon as possible, invade France. The British were not as convinced of the wisdom of that policy. Winston Churchill proposed a Mediterranean strategy, attacking what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, going after the Italians, the much weaker of the two Axis enemies here in Europe. This is based basically on British successes or lack thereof up to this point in the war. As we've talked about, the British had pretty good success against the Italians. They had very little against the Germans. The British army has been reinforced, but the British manpower pool is running low. Churchill's aware of this. He knows that if an invasion of France fails, that Britain's role in this war will then become minimal. And as a result of that, their influence on the post-war peace will also be minimal. He wants to postpone any landing in France. So it's his and the British who come up with the idea of landing here in North Africa to try and end the North African campaign completely, to help out Montgomery in Egypt, get rid of Rommel, clear all of North Africa, and clear the decks for a possible invasion of Italy. Roosevelt and the Americans are more or less forced to go along because we don't have a very big army yet. The British are going to be providing most of the troops. So while the U.S. Army builds up, we will follow Britain's lead. We also decide, and I think I may have mentioned this already, so if I'm repeating myself, I apologize, but we also decided to carry out round-the-clock bombing campaigns on Germany. The United States would bomb during the day, the British would bomb at night. The United States believed at this point in what we called precision bombing. We would try to bomb railroads and factories and try to avoid causing damage to civilian areas. The British knew this wasn't going to be particularly successful. They had tried it. It didn't work. We're going to do it anyway. In order to do precision bombing, we have to fly over during the day. So the U.S. will bomb in daylight hours. The British at this point are simply carrying out terror bombing raids, trying to annihilate German cities in retaliation for what the Germans had done to British cities. They're not concerned about pinpoint accuracy. They are concerned about losing British planes to German fighters. The U.S. will lose large numbers of bombers to German fighters during the course of their daylight bombing campaign over the course of 1942 and into 1943, until we developed the P-51 Mustang fighter, which had the range to accompany American bombers deep into Germany. That's 1943. So the bombing campaigns will also begin. Of really critical importance is the war in the Atlantic. The United States is not going to be able to make its power felt in Europe whatsoever if the German submarines continue to run rampant in the Atlantic as they do in early 1942. The submarines sail across the Atlantic to the American coastline, an area where we did not employ convoys, and they have what the German submariners called a second happy time, where they are able to sink large quantities of American shipping without being in any real danger themselves. We didn't even black out our cities, so it was easy for German submarine captains to find targets behind the backdrop of the lights of New York, or Jacksonville, Florida, or Charleston, South Carolina, etc. The Germans sink hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping while the U.S. tries to get a convoy system set up. We eventually will do that, and eventually these sinkings will be brought under control. But that takes about 6 months, and it certainly does limit the amount of supplies that we're able to send overseas to Great Britain. I will have statistics that I'll put up in a handout for everybody, probably next week, on the Battle of the Atlantic, because we'll talk about the end of the Battle of the Atlantic next week. But the U.S. and Britain do start moving that direction here for reasons that I've talked about before. The capture of an Enigma machine and the beginnings of the use of escort aircraft carriers. All of that makes feasible these landings in North Africa that do have a very real effect on the Eastern Front. They are one of the reasons why Manstein can't make it back to Paulus. He simply doesn't have the manpower. The Germans on the Eastern Front no longer have the manpower. Stalin never gave the Western Allies credit for this being a real front, for this actually pulling German troops away from the Russians. But it did. And it's one of the factors that allowed the Russians to have the great success they have. So as we see, if we go back here to the Eastern Front, the Russian drive to the west continues. They will also, here in early 1943, retake Rostov. What you're looking at this juncture is February of 1943. The conditions in Stalingrad are abysmal over this winter. There is not enough supplies. Frostbite, hypothermia become very severe problems. Roughly half of von Paulus's 6th Army become casualties to primarily the weather. Disease as well, but mostly weather conditions. Von Paulus begins considering surrender. He asks Hitler for permission to surrender to save the lives of his men. Hitler refuses, and in late January of 1942, Hitler promotes von Paulus to field marshal, because no field marshal in the history of the German or Prussian armies had ever surrendered to the enemy. Von Paulus gets this award. He receives this on February 1st. He's insulted by it. and on February 2nd decides to surrender. Um, he had been a fervent Nazi. He has lost his faith in his Fuhrer, and he surrenders on February 2nd, cutting what little deal he can on behalf of his men with Zhukov. 110,000 German soldiers march out of Stalingrad and into Soviet POW camps, where they will be treated pretty poorly as forced laborers, but still be treated better than the Germans were treating the Russians, who they had taken prisoner over the course of 1941 and 1942. If we zoom out, you'll see that it is not just in the south where the Russians start enjoying massive success. The offensive here in the south continues, but there are also Russian counterattacks in February on the northern front, and the Germans are forced to pull back from Moscow. The siege of Leningrad is lifted, and the Russians are able to start bringing supplies back into that city. They retake Kharkov and Rostov by the 12th of February. The momentum on the Eastern Front now shifts towards the Russians. There will be, as you see here, a German counterattack, and it will stabilize the lines and stop the Russian offensive. And at that point, the spring rains set in, and everything grinds to a halt on the Eastern Front. But the losses at Stalingrad are irreplaceable. And it's these losses at Stalingrad that drive home to the German people, for the first time, that they might actually lose this war. That up to this point, Hitler has been enormously successful. He's still a major national hero. The German people still retain great faith in him. There is an assumption that once the weather gets better in summer, the Germans will once again restart the offensive in the Soviet Union, and they will be able to eliminate the Soviets. But things have changed. The Soviet Union's getting stronger. Germany is getting weaker. German forces are now fighting on two very real fronts. The North African front is no longer a sideshow. There are a lot of German troops down there. This is a two-front war. What's more, American Lend-Lease aid is turning the Russian army into a very mobile army, while the German army is becoming less mobile. The Germans are still building large numbers of tanks, and they are sending them mostly to the Eastern Front. There are plans for a major campaign there in 1943. They will not go as planned. We'll talk about those when we get to class next week.